Bex works with us here at Codec. She is a guru of all things digital. I'm not, so I'm going to sit and learn at her feet. But what I asked Bex to do was to come and give us just some things that we could learn about preaching from the digital world. So I'm going to hand over to Bex. Thank you.
Okay. Right. That's just my title slide. And for those of you who like this kind of thing, there is a link to it online, which is why you don't have a printout of it. We're going digital right from the start. So what I'm kicking off with is an extract, or the starting piece, for a bit that I wrote for the church growth piece, which is that we're kind of in an age where people are not really even thinking about going to church particularly. There's plenty of other things going on a Sunday particularly. You can go shopping, go to football, all these kind of things. So when I put this out, it picked up quite a lot of interest. But people are still looking for something. So if they want to connect, how are we going to connect with them? How are we going to be in a place where people are going to be looking? Where are they looking and where are they spending time? And where a lot of people are spending time is online. Billions and billions of hours are being spent online. So we need to think that that's really important. One of the things that I think is really important, and I've made a note to myself, there's a big debate about the question of presence and embodiment, but that's not really where I'm going today, but I'm quite happy to talk about it over the break. And quite a lot of us are quite interested in that. Can we do some of this stuff solely digitally? But what we're really concerned about is the idea is what happens online is not something that's virtual. So I try and avoid this dichotomy of real and virtual and refer to it as online and offline. So it's a part of our whole world. When people are working on computers, they're using their body to type or speak or use the YouTube. So the body is part of that experience online. So don't think of it as solely virtual. And what happens online will also affect offline. You'll hear all the stories of communication happening on the internet and then kids going to school and it all going horribly wrong. So think how that works. So see it as part of the whole. And in fact, Pope Benedict the 16th, I was reading that, said the digital environment is not a parallel or purely virtual world, but is part of the daily experience of many people, especially the young. Social networks are the result of human interaction, but for their part, they also reshape the dynamics of communication, which build relationships. A considered understanding of this environment is therefore a prerequisite for a significant presence there. So the Catholic Church are actually doing quite a lot already, and I think the Church of England is starting to catch up once Justin Welby joined. When I talk to a lot of people, a lot of what people are thinking about is the digital, it's a marketing tool, and people aren't comfortable with the idea that a lot of what we're doing is marketing. And I think not what we're doing is, even within your preaching, are you giving your congregation an idea that in their being, part of their being is their digital presence. So how can they be something online that is appealing to people and will draw people in? And how do you build that into your preaching? How do we help people live authentic lives online and offline? Very much, a lot of the people I also work with think that social media is the last thing they do. You've sorted out your preaching, you've sorted out everything else, and then at the last minute you say, let's send a tweet about that and that'll solve everything. You really need to build it into what you're thinking about strategically within a church. So it needs, and very much what you need to think about with this is quite often, if you're the minister or the main preacher, you tend to think, oh no, this is just one more thing that I have to do. And the whole point is, if you can give leadership which is not necessarily you having to do all of this, but giving other people permission to do it and saying it's an important part of what we're doing, I think it becomes less overwhelming. So you're giving people permission to tweet in a session or, engage in some way. And this is all part of the whole life of the community, the same as preaching is part of the whole picture of what you're doing in church. And how this really works is what we call networks of networks. So if I share something, I run something called the Big Bible Project for Codec. If I share something on the Big Bible Facebook page, it'll pick up a handful of likes. If I share it on my page, because it's particularly affected me and I've talked about why it's interesting, it will probably suddenly pick up another 20 or 30 likes, because people connect with the people that they know. And this is what is really happening with online. And we've got a real opportunity to engage a wider number of people in these conversations. Many people online, their only experience of church will be through their friends. So if we can get the people in the church to share parts of the message, then that may really work. And it's really thinking about the interactive nature of this. I mean, Kate's been talking about sort of the monologue sermon still having a place, and it's a discussion that we have. My last job was specifically as an e-learning person. We had a lot of discussions about whether you could kind of replace the standard lecture with something completely different. And there's a phrase that are we moving from the sage on the stage to the guide on the side? And is that something we need to do as preachers as well? But I think we've got very, very used to the broadcast age, a kind of model of passive presentation-based services, which I'm very aware I'm doing now, but that sometimes they have a place. I was just about something about 3 points in a sermon, but formulaic stuff has its place. It works because it works. But we need to be prepared for the fact that members of your congregation may be sat there with their smartphones, they may be looking things up on the Bible, they may be looking things up on Google, they may be disagreeing with what you're saying, they may be live blogging bits of it. But this is great, particularly I've got a lot of friends who are unable to get to church. I've got a friend who's allergic to most chemicals, so shower gels and everything, she just can't go to church, but she can engage online. Because she can see what is coming out from church if people are sharing that. You've also got the opportunity to invite guest speakers from all over the world if you really wanted to. So there's lots of things you can do online with that. So I've pinched a little bit of this from someone's online paper. I'm really thinking about, are we moving from a kind of one to many to a more engaged online presence, and I'll show you how some of that works. So this was something I did for a friend in Winchester. He asked 5 friends to give him a 90-second video on Mark 4, and he used that in the sermon. So it wasn't the preacher saying, this is what I think about Mark 4, this was how it was hitting people on the ground. I am very much an ordinary theologian, to use that word. I have no academic training as a theologian. I'm a digital historian. So he just said, be totally yourself and talk about it exactly how it strikes you. There's no right or wrong with this answer. And that seemed to go down quite well. You can do it more formally with like really complicated software. I wouldn't recommend that unless you're a mega church, really. But it's great for kind of, we do it sometimes with the e-learning stuff, and you'll have 200 people having a conversation from all around the world. In fact, I'm speaking at an online conference this evening with people from Australia and the States. So great way to connect with all those people. This is my brother's church in Bournemouth, and they live stream all their services. So the same as Pete's doing today. And I think they usually have sort of 100 odd views of what they're doing. That's 100 extra people seeing that service that wouldn't see it. That's still slightly less than in the building, but that's, and I know there's a lot of people in that church who sit there while they're at home with the kids and are able to watch the evening service as well as the morning one. And my niece, when she was christened, I was able to watch that because I wasn't able to get to Bournemouth, but I was able to watch it online, and that was great. It's a really nice way of being included. Someone has put on Christianity Today, they said, we don't need to sit through average or mediocre sermons anymore. The number of views and shares, tweets and likes let us select the best, most dynamic, most beloved preaching available. Now that is quite controversial, I think. Do we only want entertaining sermons? I think there's quite a lot to think about in there. And I just thought it's worth saying, if you decide to do that, there is a legal requirement to have an area that's camera free, so that people don't have to be on camera. I think this is really what I'm thinking, is if we're thinking about the online as somewhere as a space. I think as churches we're often very geographically concerned, but we need to accept the global nature of what we're doing if we're sharing this kind of stuff. And I think quite often when you're preaching, particularly if you have the same congregation every week, you kind of accept a certain amount of knowing and that you're building on something from week to week. How does that change if someone's just downloading one podcast or just watching one live sermon? Does that change things? And actually, I'm still quite heavily involved with my old church in Winchester because they have active online presence, so I can still chat with my old friends from down there. So it is changing a lot in that way. I was going to play this, but the audio doesn't seem to be working, so technology, hooray. But because it's online, you can go and listen to it. And I collected a series of audios at Greenbelt. And this was Catherine, who was talking about tweeting in church, which is always one of the most controversial subjects for a lot of people. And she really wants us to think about church as a whole and think about where the traditional sermon fits in there and how tweeting can bring more people into it. And think about really why might people not want to tweet in church? What assumptions are we making about people's wishes or not wishes? And what might encourage more engagement? What might help people understand? This is some of my tweets from, I can't remember which service, but a sermon I used #sermon, which works a bit like an index. And using a mixture of this and on Facebook, what I found was 3 of my friends asked to come to church with me, not friends I would ever have thought of inviting, because I was just weaving this in as a part of my whole life. If you can get your congregation to do that, they're the best ambassadors for what you're doing. Let's not be embarrassed to talk about what we heard at church, but find ways to share that in a powerful way. And it's far more interesting if it's not just me tweeting, but it invariably quite often is. There's quite a lot of debates about whether you should use things like an iPad for preaching. There's ideas about, the sacredness of a paper Bible. Tim Hutchins did a great talk on it the other week. You can find it online. But it's really thinking about these are just the tools of your trade, and if you happen to be using an iPad somewhere else, there's nothing wrong with using it in the sermon. You've got to think about what the message sends if using one or the other. But it's a great tool. And what I did at the bottom was I just linked to a preacher who gave a list of all the tools that he used when he's preparing his sermons, and digital tools that really help him do it and really save time, which I think is probably key for lots of people. Then I sort of went and had a look at this guy. He's known as Pro Blogger online. He was a Baptist minister for about 10 years. He's still an active Christian, but he decided that he could reach more people by being a blogger and not blogging about Christianity, which is very interesting. He blogged about his expertise in photography and his expertise in blogging. And his wife allowed him to, they had to reach a certain amount of income before he was allowed to give up being a minister. And he, a couple of years ago, did his first sermon for about 8 years. And when he was having a look at it, he was saying actually a lot of the skills he used for that were the same as you use for blogging. You have to do your research, you find out what others are saying, but you can maybe do this in a more active way because you're actually asking people online. You're not just looking at written texts. You can actively ask people if they have recommendations. The first time I ever started using Twitter and didn't understand it for the first 3 months, and then I had a job interview and I got all the data I needed for my job interview from Twitter by people sending me, you should look at this and you should look at that. It really starts to click. But this is another active preacher who is saying, does the traditional sermon still make sense? If it still makes sense, how is it different if you're able to be challenged by people who are sat in the seat, whether they're doing it actively while you're doing it? I mean, do you have to have an iPad next to you following all the tweets? And actually, tonight, when I'm giving my talk, I don't have to worry about that. Someone will draw that to my attention. And that's a much easier way of doing it, is if there's 2 of you doing it rather than trying to do it all yourself. But really, Kate was saying, do you ask people how they've been affected by it. There's a real medium for this to come back to you. You're not going to like all of it probably, but it is a way for it to come back. A lot of the time, digital is seen as something that you could do all this innovative stuff with, and that you do everything differently. I think we need to learn from what we've done well in other stuff and see how we tweak things, rather than seeing it as a completely new. And Simon Jenkins, when we're talking in The Guardian, very much pulling up on the fact that actually if we think about it just as entertainment, and this is something, it doesn't necessarily work, and this is something that if you're online, there's particular videos that are known as Linkbait. So you know they're going to be popular enough that everyone's going to share them, but at the end of watching it you think, what did I actually gain from that? It was quite enjoyable, but has that actually changed how I live? Which I think is what we're really trying to do with this. Still at the core, and I did research in 2001, 2002 about websites, accessibility, and what we basically said is content is at the core, everything else needs to feed the content, and I still think that's true for everything. So again, this is kind of reiterating some of it. He's talking about it as a feedback loop. He can put those sermons online and get lots and lots of feedback in church. People can leave comments, although most people don't bother these days. If they're going to comment somewhere, it's usually on Twitter or Facebook. And then when he sees statistics, and I think that's where we've got to be wary about numbers, does popularity necessarily equal the most important stuff? But he can at least do a bit of listening and find out where people are. So maybe the next sermon can edit what's been there and change some of that. One of the things I forgot to say about the previous slides is what's quite interesting is some of these people used to go out into physical cafes and do their sermon preparation in a space where they were known, and the cafe owner who wasn't a Christian would come over every time and chat to him about what he was doing, and people got to know him. And I think some people are starting to do that digitally, doing their sermon preparation openly and inviting other people to comment before you ever get to the pulpit. So by the time you get to Sunday, it's actually quite well developed from other people's voices, and then being open to the conversation that comes afterwards. When we're talking about length, again, online, the conventional wisdom is most people won't watch more than 30 seconds on YouTube. I think you do have to capture people in that first 30 seconds. But actually, if the content is interesting enough, people will watch for a long time and won't notice. The real difference between a boring 1-minute video and a 5-minute really good video, and they both feel kind of as long as each other. Probably the 5-minute one feels shorter. So again, you've got that balance between entertainment and actually being quite punchy. And the one thing that Darren Rouse said was actually learning to be more punchy online, where the conventional wisdom is cut it in half and then cut it in half again, has made him far more punchy in his sermons. So it kind of goes both ways. So this is just a little bit from a Codec study that I think it was Kate and Pete and maybe some others did, which looked and actually found out lots of people do still want to listen to a full-length sermon, because if we live in an age of sound bites, it's actually quite nice to be able to sit and listen to something substantial. So don't think you have to turn it all short. But it really thinking about, is it motivating people to change their behaviours? I think Kate brought that out as well. Is actually, if you're listening to people, if you're using this technology to listen to what people want, some of it will be face-to-face and then some of it can be online. You can maybe have a Facebook group for your church and say, what do you think of this week's sermon? If you make it closed, then people might feel more free to chat about stuff more openly. Open sites can be seen by everyone on Facebook, closed ones can only be seen by people who join them. And actually think about, what are we doing that's actually transforming people's lives? And we now have 24/7 lives are possible, if not particularly healthy. So how are we going to engage with that? How are we going to help the people? And I've seen people saying, you know, my child's still wide awake, and in fact they put a sermon on and sat and watched it, and that was their form of kind of entertainment, for want of a better word. So it is putting the material where people want it. So you're using the online to change what you're saying potentially, make it more available to people and encourage people to engage with it rather than be a sort of one-way thing. So that was all I was going to say. This is a set of resources that I pulled, so if people want to go and have a look at the, I don't know, 100 documents I looked at to pull this together, that's on there. So